As with pretty much all aspects of Django, we can configure this form behavior and how the form is rendered and which label is showing up here and so on. We can configure this as well. For this, we just need to go to our code and then to the forms.py file where we define the form. And then for this username field here, we can set a couple of options. We can add a couple of keyword arguments that allow us to configure this field and therefore this field's behavior in the template. For example, there is a label option where we can set our own label. By default, Django will use our field name, capitalize the first word, and replace underscores with white space, which is why we see username like this here. But if you want to show your name instead, then we just can set label like this. And if I now save this and reload this page, now we see your name here. So that is one basic thing we can configure. For the char field, we can, for example, also add a max length argument to restrict the maximum length and set this to 100 characters. If we do that and save this, if we inspect this input, we see the max length attribute was added here. And even if I manually remove this to circumvent this validation, if I now enter something super long, which is longer than 100 characters, so if I enter a very long dummy string here and I click send, then I get an error message because this is being validated on the server again, because of this max length argument I added. Now maybe we're also not happy with the error messages. And for that, we can add a error messages key here and set this to a dictionary where the key names are the validator identifiers Django knows, and the values are then the error messages for those kind of errors. So for example, all form fields, including the char field, by default have the required validator. And if we submit an empty field, it's the required error message that will be shown. We can override this by setting required here to your name must not be empty, for example. Then we could also set the max length error message and say, please enter a shorter name. Like this. And now we would have our own error messages. If you want to allow the submission of an empty field, for example, you could set required to false. The default is true, so by default that field is treated as required. But if it's optional, you could set it to false. But since I want to show you these custom error messages in action, I will remove that or set it to true. But again, that's the default. So I'll remove that so that we do require that field. And with that change made, now here, if I manually disable this max length attribute and the required attribute to ensure that I can work my way around this browser side validation and submit the empty form, if I do this and click send, now I see my custom error message here. And if I submit it in an empty state after removing required, then I see my custom error message here as well. So that's how we can customize this. But we're also not limited to customizing our messages and labels. Now, as always, if you want to learn about all the options, the official docs are your friend. And there it's the form fields reference which you might want to check out. Here you'll learn about all the different methods and arguments which you can set on a form field, like required, which you just saw, or the label, and also a couple of other values which might come in handy for you from time to time. Here you also see all the possible form fields you can create besides the char field, but we're also going to see more options there soon, so I'm not going to go through that list yet. I of course just want to make you aware of it so that you know this resource for your next project. But now let's dive into how we can customize what is being rendered where instead of just customizing these texts which are being output.